Good evening, and again, welcome to the annual advisory board dinner and lecture. After the remarks that I made in at the Humanities Center, I remember years ago going to our middle daughter's graduation at the University of Wisconsin in Madison when Donna Shalala was still the provost. And she began the talk by saying, "Let me introduce to you, graduates, let me introduce to you the finest faculty and student body in the world." And I thought perhaps I sounded too hyperbolic when I was praising all of you here. But I really feel as disingenuous as Donna Shalala was, that I was most ingenuous. I mean it. I think that the faculty on the board are representative of the very best that FIU has, and the students here tonight reflect the best that come out of FIU. And so it's a wonderful evening for me. I'm very grateful to all of you for being here, and I'm very grateful to Dr. Clement Fadovich for giving the second lecture under the eyes of the first lecturer, Dr. John Stewart, who gave a terrific talk last year on the architecture around FIU. I'm trying to set the bar high. Usually, I like to begin, usually I like to have at our lectures an eminent campus personality to underscore just how important the lecturer himself or herself is. That's not available tonight, but I'm still very glad to be able to be the one to introduce Professor Fadovich, who got his PhD at Cornell University and has been doing research on the development of liberalism in the 17th and the 18th century. You can ask him during the Q&A whether that's a dead-end subject now or not. I don't know, but it certainly is something for which he's produced a great deal of very important research, including a book from Johns Hopkins University Press, Outside the Law, Emergency and Executive Power. He's also published in such journals as the Good Society, Perspectives on Politics, the Journal of the History of Ideas. I'm sorry, my handwriting is so bad. Even when I write, I can't handwriting. For a month in third grade, Sister Marie Lewis kept me after school practicing my cooking, and I just finally wore her down. Anyway, and the American Journal of Political Science and the History of Political Thought. Tonight he will be talking about economic inequality and the condition of freedom. It's a very great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Fadovich to give our second, I'm sorry, I'm deferring the ending, to give our second advisory board lecture. Thank you very much.
Let me start off by thanking Michael for this very kind invitation and also for the very generous introduction. I've been a member of the advisory board basically from the beginning, and it's an honor to be on the board. I think it's a really important thing that the center does, and I think it does a lot of important work, and I'm just very proud to be a part of it and to have you here tonight. And I'd like to thank each of you for taking the time this evening to come. So you mentioned that John has set the bar very high. One thing you didn't mention is that it's possible to limbo under it. So again, my talk, in many ways, our interest in the past is shaped by our interest in the present. And I think this is especially true in the case of political history. So when we decide to study the past, that's say deciding what's important, whose views matter or have significance, and how we should study the past, I think we often do so from the perspective, interests, and concerns of the present. And I think that in a lot of ways, American politics in the last few years exemplifies what I'm talking about. So I'll ask you to think back to the spring and summer of 2009, only months after the election of President Barack Obama. As we were often reminded at the time, the country was in the midst of the greatest economic downturn since the Great Depression. The stock market had lost nearly half of its value from its all-time high. Businesses were facing bankruptcy. Large financial firms like Lehman Brothers had ceased to exist. home foreclosures were on the rise, and of course, and perhaps most importantly, unemployment was at its highest level in decades. And it's in this situation that it's not surprising that the budget deficit would start to spike. Anytime there's an economic downturn, of course, the government takes in less revenue and spends a lot more. And in this particular case, the only difference from previous downturns was the scope of the deficit that the country was facing during the Great Recession. Right? The government was taking in far less revenue because more people were out of work, or they were working shorter hours, and of course it was spending large sums of money on unemployment and other forms of assistance. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, better known as the stimulus package, added an estimated $787 billion to the deficit in the form of new spending and tax cuts. But there was one more thing that threatened, and I say threatened, to add to the deficit: President Obama's health care reform plan. Though the country was still stuck in a deep recession and no serious attempts were being made to hold Wall Street accountable for plunging the economy into a recession and near depression, the president presented a sweeping plan to reform the nation's dysfunctional healthcare system in a joint session to Congress in February of 2009. Now, while some questioned the president's priorities and suggested that healthcare reform could wait until more pressing problems were dealt with, the president had argued that healthcare reform was very much an economic issue and it would address the needs of ordinary citizens. Of course, this didn't fly with everyone, and this plan to reform the healthcare system came on the heels of the Wall Street bailout, which was concluded in the final months of the Bush administration. And it's out of this situation that the Tea Party emerged. Here was a movement, partly grassroots, partly funded by wealthy financiers and political operatives from the top down, that challenged the president's policies and governing principles. Not only were the president's policies misguided and counterproductive, they argued, but they were also antithetical to the principles and ideals on which the country was founded. In particular, they argued, the debt, taxes, and additional powers required by the new government programs threatened the very ideals of freedom and limited government on which the country was based. Now, almost every political actor, movement, and party in the United States tends to invoke the founders or some aspect of the founding to justify their own ideals or their own platform. But probably no other group in recent history has invoked the founders and identified themselves so enthusiastically and single-mindedly as the Tea Party. And almost everything the Tea Party did harkens back to the country's beginnings. The name itself is, of course, derived from the infamous Tea Party of 1773, where the Sons of Liberty, organized by Samuel Adams, dumped 3 shiploads of tea into Boston Harbor. One thing that's often not mentioned and wasn't mentioned at the time is that the name Tea Party wasn't actually coined until 1834, and the event itself was not commemorated or celebrated until decades after it had occurred. But the name wasn't the only thing that the Tea Party borrowed from the founding. They also took the dressing up in colonial garb, remember people wearing tri-corner hats. They took to displaying the Gadsden flag, which is that flag with a coiled snake with the word "Don't tread on me" on the bottom against a yellow background. And they also revived a variety of symbols and traditions associated with the founding. In May of 2009, Sean Hannity on his show started invoking the Liberty Tree and displaying it behind himself as both a symbol and an inspiration of the movement that he helped promote on his show. In some cases, authors would begin to actually title the names of their books after famous slogans. One case in point is Matt Kibbe and Dick Armey's "Give Us Liberty," a Tea Party manifesto. But probably the most significant way that the Tea Party supporters and sympathizers invoked the past to address the concerns of the present was to quote the founders and deeds and words in almost every term. And most of the quotes and ideas that they cited expressed the founders' views on limited government, low taxes, respect for individual liberty, and concern for property rights. And their favorites were generally Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson. In fact, Paine was so popular that Glenn Beck actually issued his own version of Thomas Paine's famous Common Sense for a new age. And Thomas Paine's writings were especially likely to be cited on a variety of blogs and were often quoted in discussions. And one favorite time there's a discussion about the proper size and scope of government was the following, taken from his famous pamphlet. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one. Jefferson, too, was often invoked, but this time to justify the idea that government should be small, limited, and frugal. One Jefferson quote that circulated widely since 2009 and still comes up on a number of blogs and sites concerns the supposed injustice of redistribution. The quote reads, "To take from one because it is thought that his own industry and that of his fathers has acquired too much, in order to spare to others who, or whose fathers have not exercised equal industry and skill, is to violate arbitrarily the first principle of association, the guarantee to everyone the free exercise of his industry and the fruits acquired by it." One thing that's never mentioned whenever this quote is cited is Jefferson's complicity in slavery, which clearly violates the principles contained in that quote. But to those who argued that government has a necessary and legitimate role to play in alleviating economic hardships, easing poverty, or minimizing inequality, Tea Party members often argued that these practices and these policies would imperil freedom. Not only would they create and reinforce a culture of dependency, they often argued, but they would give government new powers to threaten and undermine individual freedom. Now, critics of the Tea Party, including most notably those who participated in the Occupy Wall Street protests, sometimes countered with their own quotes from Jefferson and other founders. But for the most part, references to the founders by those outside of the Tea Party were fairly limited. Now, the Tea Party hasn't exactly had a monopoly on the meaning of the founding, but it's done much, much more to define the founding than anyone else in recent years. As a result, it's pretty easy to come away with the impression that the founders viewed government attempts to promote economic equality as threats to individual freedom. Speaking from across the centuries, the founders seem to be warning us that attempts to address economic inequalities and hardships would jeopardize property rights and individual freedom. If the founders were concerned about equality, they argued, it was equality under the law or equality of opportunity at best, and certainly not equality of outcome. Economic inequality, they argued, was simply the price we have to pay to preserve individual initiative, national prosperity, and most importantly, individual freedom. However, if we actually look more closely at the words and deeds of the founders, including the very ones that are cited with the most enthusiasm and frequency by the Tea Party, we see that most of them did not find a necessary conflict between freedom and equality. In fact, many, though certainly by no means, and one of the points I want to make is that there was a lot of variation here, many of the founders believed that some degree of economic equality is a necessary precondition for freedom. For many founders, pursuing economic equality was not a threat to freedom, but a precondition for the achievement of freedom. And it's this proposition that I want to explore in the rest of my talk. But before I do, I want to make two sort of broad preliminary points about the study and use of history. I see there's some historians here, so I hope I don't offend or step on any toes. And the first point I want to make is that just as there's a lot of diversity of opinion today, so there was in the past. We sometimes look to the past in hopes of finding some sort of unity or consensus that may never have actually existed. More often than not, individuals in other periods were just as divided and conflicted over important questions of morality, politics, and economics as we are today. And when it comes to the founders in particular, it's important to keep in mind that they rarely spoke with a unified voice. So, the differences between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, or between Thomas Paine and Alexander Hamilton, for instance, were just as significant as any similarities between them. And the second point I want to make, and this is the one I'll spend the rest of my talk addressing, is that the past can sometimes be a source of fresh insights and new perspectives on contemporary controversies. In politics, our tendency is to look for the past to support or reinforce ideas we already hold. But I'd like to suggest that the study of the past can sometimes remind us of what we've forgotten in some sense. I'd say we can sometimes find new, or maybe better put, forgotten ideas that open up new possibilities and new ways of thinking today. We can't ever retrieve the past, but I think we can learn from it. And when it comes to the question of economic inequality, I think debates that occurred during the founding can help us better understand why it might be a political and not just a moral or economic problem. For many founders, minimizing economic inequality was not just a moral obligation, it was a political imperative. And this is because certain levels of economic inequality either violated liberal ideals or undermined Republican values, or both. And when I refer to liberal ideas throughout the rest of this talk, I mean that political tradition that begins with Locke and argues that the preservation of individual freedom is a priority, even the ultimate end of government. And when I talk about republicanism, I refer to that tradition, the political tradition, that dates back to ancients like Cicero and Aristotle, who believed that the preservation of free government ultimately depends on the efforts, participation, and virtue of ordinary citizens. So for liberal thinkers like Paine, government intervention was justified because certain kinds of economic inequality, in his view, deprived individuals of their natural rights. For many Republican writers, extreme levels of economic inequality were inconsistent with the very idea of free government. In the words of Sentinel, a critic of the Constitution, who's widely believed to be Samuel Bryan, wrote the following: "A republic can exist only where the body of the people are virtuous and where property is pretty equally divided." Now, whatever their feelings about economic inequality, members of that generation agreed that class differences were matters of public concern. How they thought to address those differences was where they disagreed. Now, you sometimes hear politicians say that merely pointing out disparities in wealth or income is to engage in a kind of class warfare. I would say if that's the case, then it's the longest running war in American history. Because there have been debates about class, and class has been central to American politics from its beginning. And I mean that even before the Revolution. In a Gallup poll that was conducted at the end of last year, over 70% of respondents actually said that they identified with the middle class, and that's actually down from 83% in 2009, again, in the midst of the Great Recession. Other polls actually find the numbers much, much higher. The reason I bring this up is that, generally speaking, there's this sense that we are a classless society. There's this sort of interest in sort of maintaining the idea of America as a classless society. But during the founding, there was actually a widespread belief that society was permanently subdivided into distinct classes. Americans at the time generally believed that there was considerably more economic equality and mobility in America than anywhere else in the world, and they generally rejected the idea that anyone's class status should be permanent. But they also accepted class stratification as an unavoidable fact of life. As Massachusetts farmer and soldier Willie Manning put it, societies were always divided between the few and the many. And that class consciousness was reflected in the politics of the time. In fact, class politics in the original 13 states was a significant factor contributing to the creation of the Constitution. I can't take you through the entire history of the 1780s, but I'll give you a few highlights. For the decade after the Revolutionary War began, state politics was dominated by issues of class and inequality. In states like New York, there were actually class-based political parties. In most states, fierce battles were waged over the redistributive effects of different policies, especially those relating to taxes and the repayment of the war debt. Debtors and creditors vied for control of the state legislatures to enact policies that would favor their interests, often at the explicit expense of others' interests. Debates over the issuance of paper money were often most likely to divide people along class lines. But much of this debate wasn't just about addressing the concerns or needs of those at the bottom. In some cases, politicians explicitly wanted to redistribute wealth upwards. And a case in point is the wealthy financier and future signer of the Constitution, Robert Morris, who actually wanted to enact policies that would do just that because he thought that ordinary farmers and laborers wouldn't handle their wealth responsibly and wouldn't do enough to promote prosperity, or at least not as much as national elites such as himself would. Now, efforts to address economic inequality weren't restricted to the former channels of government either. Many of the battles over class inequality were actually waged out of doors in the form of protests, demonstrations, and other occurrences that threatened public order. The most dramatic and consequential of these was an insurrection that took place, or started in western Massachusetts in the fall of 1786 and ended in January 1787. Participants in what's known as Shays' Rebellion seized weapons and forcibly shut down courts to prevent them from foreclosing on homes of indebted farmers. Now, for many elites, Shays' Rebellion was the final straw. And in fact, if you read letters and public statements at the time, Shays' Rebellion comes up again and again. General Henry Knox claimed that the Shayites, as they were derisively called, were, quote, determined to annihilate all debts, public and private. And others added that they were determined to redistribute property. Claims like that actually helped convince many elites that something had to be done to strengthen the national government and restore order in the states to protect property from the lower orders. The specter of further disorder and more threats against property galvanized many national elites into supporting a convention to amend the Articles of Confederation, which was essentially the constitution we had at the time. And issues of class inequality were also at the forefront of debates at the Constitutional Convention itself. Many delegates talked about the need to check democracy, which was still closely associated with the rule of the lower orders. Elbridge Gerry, whose name gives us gerrymandering, from Massachusetts, reminded his colleagues that, quote, the evils we experience flow from the excess of democracy. And although he said he still considered himself a supporter of republicanism, he confessed that his enthusiasm had been dampened by the leveling spirit that had recently manifested itself, especially in his home state of Massachusetts. One of the main arguments that was offered in favor of the Senate during the convention, which, keep in mind, the Senate was at the time going to be chosen by state legislatures, was that it would act as a check against redistributive policies that might be favored by those in the lower house. The peg-leg conservative Gouverneur Morse, who was actually responsible for drafting most of the language of the Constitution, said he actually expected members of the Senate to possess, quote, great personal property and, quote, the aristocratic spirit. So, in other words, one of the major institutions of our government was designed with this sort of class purpose in mind. And class, divisions also played a big role in the ratification of the Constitution. Critics often argue that the Constitution favored the rich, and they would point to Article 1, Section 10, which prohibits states from impairing contracts. Patrick Henry summed up this opinion when he said, I dread the operation of it on the middling and lower class of people. It is for them I fear the adoption of this system. Now, the adoption of the Constitution by no means put an end to class politics, but I would suggest that it did transform it. Now, instead of having debates about the structure and power of government and how those would impact inequality, the debate turned to questions of how specific policies would impact economic inequality. And most students of this period are pretty familiar with how Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton's ambitious plans to repay the Revolutionary War debt and establish a national bank tended to promote the interests of the wealthy, sometimes at the expense of other classes. But every legislative battle didn't necessarily result in a victory for the upper classes. There were instances where members of Congress actually worked to minimize economic inequalities and hardships. There were successful attempts to make the tax system more progressive, make Western lands more readily available to ordinary people, and establish public hospitals for the care of sick and disabled sailors. In most instances, support for these policies was framed in terms of fairness or humanitarianism. The records of congressional debates are full of expressions of sympathy and compassion for the plight of the disadvantaged. A good example of this actually comes from the debate over the first labor law that was passed in the United States. Writing in a newspaper in favor of a policy to improve the working conditions of sailors, James Madison, who was normally very cerebral and cold in his writing, pulled on the heartstrings of his readers with the following words. He said, the condition which the blessings of life are most denied is that of the sailor. His health is continually assailed and his span shortened by the stormy element to which he belongs. In the supply of his wants he often feels a scarcity, seldom more than a bare sustenance. How unfortunate that in the intercourse by which nations are enlightened and refined, that their means of safety extended, the immediate agent should be distinguished by the hardest conditions of humanity. And by the way, this was not an exception. He goes on and on like this, both here and in debates in Congress, and many members of Congress expressed a lot of sympathy for sailors. Surprised, to my own surprise in reading some of this stuff, there's a lot of concern for sailors who seem to have. Now, I'd be happy to discuss these and other policies that were debated in Congress at the time, but in the remainder of my talk, what I'd like to do is discuss and focus on Paine and Jefferson. And not just because of the founders who were cited with the most frequency in some of these recent debates that I noted at the beginning of my talk, but also because I think they have something valuable to add to our understanding of the relationship between class and politics, and more specifically, the relationship between equality and freedom. And I would argue that they were interested in minimizing economic inequality, not only for reasons of fairness or compassion. They were also interested in addressing economic inequality in order to preserve the conditions of freedom. As they saw it, disparities in wealth matter because they often translate into disparities in power. In other words, preventing political inequalities meant preventing or at least mitigating economic inequalities. Let me start with pain. Promoting economic equality was actually a lifelong interest for Paine, who actually first got involved in politics as a tax collector seeking higher wages for tax collectors who, in his view, were underpaid. And he wasn't just speaking out of self-interest. Even when he was no longer a tax collector, he continued to express some sympathy for the plight faced by these workers. And throughout his career, he articulated a variety of arguments against economic inequality and the related problem of poverty. Among other things, he argued that inequality is often arbitrary. In other words, chance plays a much bigger role than most people imagine in where one ends up. That wealth is often unjustly acquired and maintained. And here he pointed to outright coercion and examples of exploitation. That inequality destroys solidarity by increasing the social distance between members of different classes. That poverty degrades the character and corrupts the morals. And that poverty and inequality undermine national prosperity. And as important as these specific arguments were in his writings, I think that political considerations go the longest way to understanding why he believed that government intervention is legitimate and necessary. He suggested that extremes of poverty and inequality often pave the way for despotism, which is, again, his word, not mine. He described economic stratification as the disease that enervates the people. Extreme inequality weakens the people's defenses against the encroachments of their liberty. It does this by infecting them with a growing sense of apathy and disempowerment that could ultimately prove fatal to republicanism. In other words, it wasn't just bad for them, it was bad for everyone. In other words, that the fate of society, Republican society as a whole, in a sense, depended on the welfare of those who were at the lower levels. And of all the founders, Paine went the farthest in laying out a plan to rectify the problems of economic inequality and poverty. And in the handout that I distributed earlier, and with the you'll see on the second page, there's a list of Paine's plan for your convenience. Now this appears at the end of part 2 of The Rights of Man. And here, and that's actually Paine's own summary of this plan that he elaborated at much greater length in the preceding pages. And he basically laid out a rights-based 14-point plan to reduce both poverty and inequality. And 4 of the 14 articles dealt with changes in the tax code. And he argued that the first order of business was to immediately eliminate a variety of regressive taxes. And though he had himself once favored taxes on articles of consumption, essentially sales taxes and the like, he had come to understand that taxes on consumption were inherently regressive because they impose an unfair burden on the poor. But the most important part of his plan was actually to institute a steeply progressive tax. The eradication of poverty was an important objective in his tax proposal, but the promotion of equality was actually the primary goal. And I think that's something important to emphasize. The problem of poverty and inequality, albeit related, were seen as distinct problems, and there were different ways of addressing the two. The explicit aim of the system of progressive taxation, as he himself called it, was to lighten the tax burden on the lower and middle classes and to increase it on the upper classes in the interest of fairness. And in order to combat poverty and inequality as effectively as possible, you see he also developed a number of targeted proposals to help specific groups. And the two that comprised the largest number of poor in his view were 1, families with numerous children, and 2, individuals too old to work. And he developed 2 separate plans to assist these 2 groups. So he developed a plan to assist the elderly that in many ways resembles the modern system of Social Security payments. And he proposed 2 levels of payments, one to provide a certain level of support to those who reach the age of 50, and another for those who reach the age of 60. The plan to assist families was a little bit more complicated, and it consisted of several parts. One part involved annual payments for each child under the age of 14, as well as free public education for children of poor families. 2 other articles would have provided financial assistance to all families and not just those who were already poor. One of these articles would provide a small payment upon the birth of each child, and the other would provide a modest payment to each newly married couple. In a sense, what he was arguing for was kind of a startup fund for new families, something that they would have to start out with so that they weren't struggling when they started out. And like the transfer payments directed to the elderly, these articles were designed to reduce the hardships that families already faced in poverty. But unlike the old age assistance, the assistance offered to families in the form of marriage benefits, child benefits, free education, was also partly designed to keep parents and children from falling into poverty in the first place. In other words, it was a preventative measure, not just a remedy for a problem that already exists. The family assistance program were not just anti-poverty measures, but as I mentioned, were also pro-equality measures. Each part of this program to aid families aimed at making this class structure less rigid, in the hopes of helping people escape cycles of poverty. Another part of this anti-poverty program was to provide housing and work to all unemployed individuals until they could get back on their feet. And here his plan was basically to house unemployed in a large house, a large building that could house up to 6,000 workers who would work in a variety of occupations. They'd be provided with wholesome food and warm lodging, and when they were ready to get back on their feet and leave, they would get a small sum of money that would help make them economically independent. The remaining articles, which I won't get into, basically dealt with subsidies to help work cover their funeral expenses if they died away from home and were killed on the way to work, increasing the salaries of personnel in the Army and Navy, and a weekly pension for life or veterans. Now, Payne believed that these proposals would be widely acceptable because their benefits extended throughout society. In other words, the benefits were not just limited to those who would be the immediate recipients of the payments. And again, he offered a variety of reasons that he thought people could support this. One was psychological. So assuming that the sentiments operate in the same way in nearly all persons, he suggested that relief to the poor would actually salve the conscience. In other words, it would basically make people feel better. Another reason was economic. According to Payne's calculations, his plan to address poverty and its causes would actually cost far less than the system of poor aids that existed. Another reason was sociological. He predicted that the commission of petty crimes, the offspring of distress and poverty, will be lessened when no one is driven to desperation anymore. So in other words, it was a crime-fighting technique as well. But other reasons were political. Because the poor will feel that government actually works for them, he suggested, they'll be much more apt to support it. In other words, the legitimacy of government will be enhanced when those at the bottom actually feel that they're being taken care of and their interests are actually of concern to others. But I think even more important than these consequentialist considerations was the argument that support for the poor, and this is a quote, is not of the nature of charity, but of a right. Payne understood that various forms of assistance, he recommended, as civil rights that belong to individuals by virtue of their membership in society. Notice he was emphatic that this was not just charity, a handout, but was something that each person was entitled to. And this is an idea that he would develop at much further length in in an essay called Agrarian Justice, which would appear a few years later. In that essay, Payne basically argued that each member of society is entitled to compensation for being deprived of their natural right to common ownership of the earth. And here I want to pause to say a few words about Locke, because Payne's argument is essentially grounded in Locke's theory of property. For those who have read Locke's second treatise, you might recall in chapter 5 of that book, he argues that in the beginning all the world was common, that God had basically given the world to all human beings in common, and that there was no such thing as private property, no such thing as exclusive ownership of nature. And Locke had argued that the only thing that individuals possess by nature is their own body and the labor of their own body. And Locke's argument was that the only way something that is common could become private is if you mix a piece of or part of your own self with that thing that is public. In this case, if you mix your labor with the land, you appropriate it and make it your own. Now, Payne accepted part of that and followed Locke's reasoning, but only up to a point. What Payne rejected was the idea that just because you mixed a part of your labor with something, let's say a field or a grove, or I don't know my agricultural vocabulary, but fill in your own examples. Just because you mixed up some of your labor with this part of the natural environment, all of it becomes yours. Payne's view was that you're only entitled to the additional value you add through your labor. The problem, as Payne saw it, was that things have been appropriated and made private that are by right common. And the question for him is, how do you compensate people for the loss of this natural birthright? And what he proposed was that every property owner should basically pay a fee, essentially a property tax, for the exclusive right to enjoy what is by nature common property. And the money collected from these fees would go into a national fund. And the scheme he developed would basically involve direct transfer payments to two groups. The first group would consist of all young individuals. So basically, when someone reaches the age of 21, they would receive a one-time payment of £15 in compensation for the loss of their birthright. And he argued that everyone was entitled to this, whether they were property owners or not. And if they felt guilty about accepting it, they could always put it back in the fund, and therefore the funds would be bigger. But the other group that would benefit would be the elderly. And here, starting at the age of 50, every individual would receive an annual payment of £10. So he revised some of what he wrote in the handout I gave. And he also proposed a system of disability payments, which went beyond this scheme of compensating for the loss of this birthright. Any funds left over from the plan, he said, would be used to support blind and lame persons totally incapable of learning a livelihood, no matter what their age. In other words, this is a system of disability payments that he developed. He explained that his plan offered a long-term solution to the problem of inequality by addressing the underlying causes of poverty. Not only would it reduce the poverty that already exists, it would also prevent poverty from developing in the first place. Like countless Republicans before him, Payne suggested that the delicate flower of free government can thrive only if it's planted in the right socioeconomic soil. Where it already exists, free government would eventually succumb to the blight of despotism without the right conditions. In his view, poverty paves the way for despotism. Conversely, free government can't blossom unless every single part of society receives adequate nourishment. Now, let me turn to Jefferson, and I'll try to keep this short. Jefferson's interest in reducing economic inequality was primarily political. And maintaining a degree of economic inequality was not an end in itself, but a means of preserving political liberty. In keeping with centuries of Republican thought, he recognized that severe forms of inequality were incompatible with free government because they contribute to patterns of domination and dependence. In Jefferson's view, dealing with economic inequality didn't betray Republican principles, it actually helped fulfill them. He didn't seek to equalize outcomes, but he did attempt to expand and equalize opportunities. And more often than not, these policies were designed to prevent inequality from emerging in the first place, rather than reducing them after the fact. And I think that one of the reasons he didn't address the latter problem was because he didn't really see economic inequality as a serious problem in America, at least for free white men. But where he did confront the problem of economic inequality, he left no doubt that he thought it was a political problem that ought to be addressed. And most of his reflections on economic inequality, at least his most extensive ones, come from his time as a diplomat in Europe, where he witnessed firsthand some of the despair that the inequality and poverty produced. And he touched on the deleterious effects of economic inequality in nearly every letter where the subject came up to his correspondence. Among other things, inequality contributed to and sustained the misery and oppression of the lower orders. It stimulated vice and corruption in the upper classes, and it undermined the public welfare. But the worst consequence for him boiled down to the way that disparities in wealth enabled the rich to prey on the poor. And again, that's his word. And it's in these reflections on inequality in Europe that Jefferson first began to understand how concentrations of wealth often get translated into concentrations of power. Concentrations of power that could be abused to exploit and reinforce the disadvantages of the lower classes. And his most extensive, or one of his most extensive discussions of inequality actually appears in the letter that I have excerpted in the handout I gave you. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I provided for your benefit. And basically, the letter starts by recalling his conversation he had with a poor woman who happened to be traveling in the same direction as he did. And he said that he began to realize that vast concentrations of wealth, as they existed in places like France, deprived the vast majority of economic opportunity. So he puzzled over the causes of poverty for a while, and then surmised that these concentrations of wealth often lead to unproductive uses of land that actually reinforce existing class hierarchies. And one of the problems he points out is that these vast concentrations of land that are held in the hands of aristocrats were often used for gain, rather than being put to more productive uses where they could provide economic opportunity or, at the very least, food for the poor. But Jefferson didn't leave it there. He actually proposed a number of solutions. And if you look at the third paragraph, he considered a variety of options. Now, he immediately ruled out an equal division of property as impracticable, but he opened the door to other redistributive measures, including revisions to inheritance laws, the establishment of a progressive tax system, something that sounds like a guaranteed employment for the poor, and allotments of land to the unemployed. But the one thing I want to draw your attention to is the way he suggests silently lessening the inequality of property. And he notes that one thing we want to do is establish a progressive tax system that would actually exempt those below a certain level. Then he goes on to say, whenever there is in any country uncultivated lands and unemployed poor, it is clear that the laws of property have been so far extended as to violate natural rights. And notice how he here uses the same sort of language that Paine does in talking about violations of rights when we're talking about inequality. The earth is given as a common stock for man to labor and live on. If, for the encouragement of industry, we allow it to be appropriated, we must take care that other employment be furnished to those excluded from the appropriation. If we do not, the fundamental right to labor the earth returns to the unemployed. It is too soon yet in our country to say that every man who cannot find employment, but who can find uncultivated land, shall be at liberty to cultivate it, paying a moderate rent. But it is not too soon to provide by every possible means that as few as possible shall be without a little portion of land. The small landholders are the most precious part of the state. And I think one of the things that's most striking about this account is how explicit he acknowledges that there are limits to how far inequality could go without violating basic moral principles. Now, as this list and the rest of the letter and some of his other writings indicate, Jefferson's preferred method of dealing with inequality was legislative reform. But he seemed to open up the possibility of more radical means of dealing with inequality. And I don't want to read too much into the letter, but when he talks about fundamental right of labor returning to the unemployed, it's not clear exactly how that is returned and whether or not he was willing to contemplate the forcible redistribution of land. And the only reason I offer that as a possibility is because we know how he felt about other forms of protest and violent action, and some of the famous or rather infamous support for violence during Shays' Rebellion, the French Revolution, the Whiskey Rebellion, and other episodes. So it's possible that he may have contemplated, but I don't want to push that too far. Now, many of Jefferson's policy proposals, including the ones that he considered vital to his legacy and essential to the long-term health of the country, explicitly sought to equalize conditions or opportunities in the United States. Though he never believed that perfect equality could be achieved or that it was desirable, he did think that it was both possible and desirable for the government to prevent and minimize those extremes of inequality that threatened the prospects of free government. And his record in politics, both his time in Virginia as a member of the House of Delegates and in his 2 terms as President of the United States, revealed that he did take some steps to address economic equality. And he usually did so because he believed, and said he believed, that economic equality is a precondition for liberty. And now, as a member of the Virginia legislature, he favored 3 reforms that he considered vital to laying the foundations for Republican government. These included the abolition of primogeniture and entail, and a plan for general education. Now, entail and primogeniture are basically holdovers of feudalism. Entail required that all land that belonged to a particular family couldn't be divided, couldn't be alienated, had to basically be kept within a family. And this was prescribed by law. Primogeniture required that landowners basically bequeath their land to the eldest son. And what this did was basically maintain certain forms of hierarchy and equality within a family and created relations of dependence where everyone was dependent on the eldest son. And that was actually a system that was in place in Virginia. He helped abolish that. But other things he did in Virginia suggest that he went beyond just sort of removing these feudal holdovers. One of the most important things he did, though he actually failed to, one of the most important things he attempted was actually to guarantee every man, white man above the age of 21, 50 acres of land. If they didn't own 50 acres of land, they would be given 50 acres of land. If they already owned some land, but not 50, they would be brought up to 50. Now, the most immediate effect of this policy would have been to immediately enfranchise all white men, because there was an ownership, a property ownership requirement at the time. Now, you might ask, well, why wouldn't Jefferson just propose getting rid of the property requirement for voting? And I would suggest that the reason for that is that he wanted to ensure that those who were citizens actually had the economic means to carry out the responsibilities of citizenship. In other words, it wasn't just enough to get rid of these formal barriers to participation. He wanted to ensure that individuals who were entitled to vote actually had the material conditions necessary to exercise that vote. One of his most important accomplishments as president, of course, is the Louisiana Purchase. And you wouldn't necessarily think that this has anything to do with economic inequality, but I would suggest that what he was doing there was opening up vast new territory to populate it by people so that they would be able to achieve a certain kind of economic independence. His concern was that as the eastern seaboard became more and more crowded, there were fewer opportunities for individuals to be able to provide for themselves and exercise citizenship. The last thing I'll mention about Jefferson concerns his strong support for public education. At the time, only Massachusetts, I believe, provided anything like free public education. Jefferson wanted to institute free public education in Virginia, not just because he thought it would give citizens the ability to become more prosperous, but because he thought education, especially the education of the poor, would equip them for citizenship, would actually train them in the skills necessary to exercise their rights. Now, even though this bill failed in Virginia, partly because the rich didn't want to subsidize the education of the poor, he never gave up on this idea. In fact, as president, in his final speech, his address to Congress, he opened up the possibility that the national government could assume some of these responsibilities. He suggested that using the federal surplus to fund education might be a desirable way to go, even if that required the adoption of a constitutional amendment. And this brings me to my conclusion. I think that these ideas are worth keeping in mind today as levels of inequality in the U.S. approach levels that haven't been seen since the Gilded Age of the late 18th century, where so-called robber barons literally bought Senate seats and dominated state and national politics. If ideas like the ones I'm discussing here today are worth remembering, that has less to do with who said them than what they said. In other words, I'm not arguing for some sort of veneration of the founders because Jefferson was a great guy, but because Jefferson may have had ideas worth thinking about today. And while a major concern today is that public policies designed to reduce poverty and economic inequalities will foster dependence on government, the primary concern around the time of the Constitution was that poverty and inequality would produce private relations of dependence that would ultimately undermine the capacity for self-government. Though all the founders didn't see economic inequality as a problem, those who did feared that it would produce political inequality and domination. And if there's one lesson that they teach us, it's that unequal property is frequently associated with unequal power. So if we want to preserve a democratic form of government in which the people actually rule, I think it's important that we pay attention to the conditions that actually make that possible.
Well, thank you very much for a terrific talk. If that was a limbo, the choreography around us. I think we have time for a few questions now. Yes.
Jefferson may also have been concerned about the French and Spanish enterprise in the Louisiana Purchase, Louisiana-Natchez trade following Indians trade with foreign traders, including what they called the rich trade farther north, connecting into the Spanish trade into Cuba. And the French Canadians in Nova Scotia had trade there, so there was some connection between the trade in Nova Scotia and the trade in Louisiana. also Jefferson observes in his diary some look toward Erie. So that was part of his Western vision, although he also had connections, interest in the French. So I think that Jefferson's concern for greater equality was also a concern about the United States versus the French and Spanish in the Southwest as well as in the Northeast.
No, I agree with that 100%. I think Jefferson's interest in Louisiana Purchase had multiple motivations. Geopolitics was definitely one of them. But I think unlike some others, say like Hamilton, who was a supporter of the Louisiana Purchase, and was actually in favor of seizing it by force if necessary, I think that Jefferson's interest was also economic, and it was specifically, as I mentioned at the end of the talk, to create additional opportunities. I think he and Madison and others started to see that with the closing of the frontier, there were limited opportunities for people to achieve the kind of economic independence that they believed was necessary for the preservation of political independence. So I wouldn't say that those other motives aren't important.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, especially as a historian in the room. I wanted to just ask if you're familiar with Ashley White's work. She's a historian at the University of Miami, and she raises some evidence in her work that I think marries well with what you've talked about, and it's about early the arrival of immigrants from Saint-Domingue during the time of the Haitian Revolution, and how actually part of the rhetoric was about the importance of building aid and supporting the arrival of these immigrants and making sure that they're able to incorporate into the society well, and all that the society and the governments, local governments could do.
You don't mind that this is 1793,
Yes.
Yeah.
So during the time of the the Saint-Domingue Haitian Revolution, so the arrival of whites, colonial whites to Savannah, to New Orleans, to Charleston. So all of these port cities where our economies were linked to the Saint-Domingue economy. So I think that you might look at her work and maybe get into conversation with her, because there's some echoings that I felt as you talked.
I owe you dinner. No, seriously, so I came across this reading through the records of congressional debates last summer, and I have to confess I knew almost nothing about this. And I was kind of surprised that there was this debate that took place in Congress over whether or not to provide aid to refugees from Haiti. So these are white, French citizens who mostly settled in Baltimore. And the state of Maryland had provided them with some sort of assistance, and the state of Maryland was asking for some sort of compensation from Congress. And every member of Congress said we should do something. I mean, this was surprising. I talked about how there's a lack of unity. On this point, I did not find a single person raising any objections. Where they disagreed, though, was whether or not they had the constitutional powers to provide aid to refugees. And what I found really interesting, as someone who's interested in constitutional law and constitutionalism more generally, is how they tried to develop rationalizations for why they should do it, even though they weren't sure that they actually had the explicit authority. So the ultimate solution that they adopted, that James Madison came up with, is, well, we'll just sort of say that if we give them aid, it's an advance payment on the loan to France, even though payments to citizens who are refugees, in Baltimore doesn't really have anything to do with the government in France, which had already, changed. But the reason I am going on some length about this is because, one of the questions that you might be asking is, okay, so you have people like Jefferson and Payne saying we want to provide some sort of assistance either to the poor, or we want to address economic inequality because it's a political concern. The question is, does the Constitution give us the authority to do so, right? Do we have the power under the Commerce Clause or the Necessary and Proper Clause? And the same debates that we're having right now in Congress, where we sort of say, well, point to the place in the Constitution where you're allowed to do that, was happening at the time. And what fascinates me is that even among those who were members of the Constitutional Convention, like Madison and Elbridge Gerry, they couldn't agree over what certain provisions meant, and they couldn't agree about whether or not they had the power to provide assistance. So you had this divide, not between whether you should or shouldn't provide help in this instance, but whether or not there was the authority to provide the help, and if so, on what grounds. Like I said, Madison came up with what he thought was a solution that seemed to satisfy everyone, and they were able to provide the assistance in the end. But I think you mentioned Savannah. There was this huge fire that wiped out something like 2/3 of the city. In that instance, they said no.
So why do you think they're not so worried about the creation of a so-called entitlement class, 47%? It would be a drag on the economy, and so why? Part of it is obviously they're living at a time when the economy is very different. Today, you don't have to worry about job creators and a more agrarian economy. So, but why do you think they don't have this worry that you hear so much from contemporary Tea Party members?
The short answer is I don't know. In part because they don't address it. And here I'm speaking specifically about Payne and Jefferson, but there were those who did make actually that exact same point. So there's a book called Render Them Submissive, which was published in the late 70s, hasn't gotten a lot of attention, that actually looks at poor relief and programs for the poor in the city of Philadelphia. And Philadelphia was often at the forefront of different kinds of reforms, largely because of the presence of a number of Quakers, and it was the most cosmopolitan city at the time. And so there's an infusion of ideas and whatnot from the continent. And there were concerns that certain forms of assistance would create relations of dependence. And one of the ways that they dealt with that was by requiring work in exchange for different forms of assistance for those who were able to work. Alexander Hamilton is often not considered to be one of the most compassionate founders, which I think is a little bit of a mischaracterization. I think it's fair to say he didn't express a lot of interest in inequality, but he actually did express concern for the plight of specific groups. One of those was sailors. So I mentioned at one point in my talk, this plan to rebuild hospitals for sick and disabled sailors. It was actually Hamilton, who was Secretary of Treasury, had instituted, who had actually proposed that, I think, 1792, which wouldn't be until later that they adopted that. The reason I bring him up is that remind me of where I saw it.
They weren't, so they're not worried about the.
Oh yeah, so they made a distinction both in Philadelphia and Hamilton between those who were capable of working and those who were not. So Hamilton had actually proposed at one point what he called a corps of invalids, which was apparently based on the practices that existed in Europe for disabled sailors and soldiers. That would give them sort of light duty, where they could still perform certain functions that they were healthy enough to perform, but not those that were, say, more onerous or more strenuous. So there was still this expectation among a number of them where the poor could work, that they would.
But today you would have people saying, well, but then the government being the primary job creator, the government can't do as good a job. You have private entrepreneurs who are the ones who have the resources by keeping more of their money and having less tax, so that they can create the jobs that we do. So I guess they don't see it as a problem that the government would become a major job creator. In other words, it would be a problem if they could.
I mean, in fact, one of the things I didn't mention was that when Payne talked about free public education, he also thought about that as a kind of a jobs program. He thought one of the additional benefits to providing free public education was that it would provide new means of employment for local teachers.
You sound like New Deal Democrats.
Yeah.
Well, I know it's going to.
Payne more so than
Yeah.
Jefferson, but yeah.
Hey, we can support that. Hey, man, FIU. But I was struck by something similar to what Laura was mentioning, and also, correct me if I'm wrong, but at least at points, the conception of property is as a means to self-subsistence, as opposed to this ongoing support, right? So we're going to give you this land, and then you're going to be able to take care of yourself, and you won't need to be dependent on government or anybody else. So there's a sort of different conception of the role that property plays in the life of an individual in securing their liberty and their independence.
Well, I think that, the problem with, talking about property is that they had such different conceptions of property. I mean, it actually kind of has surprised me in reading some of this stuff. Because, you think that, okay, well, I was taught, when I was in school that, okay, they were sort of Lockeans and they adhered to kind of a Lockean view of property as being a natural right. And, what I found is that you have some who actually adhere to that view, right? Jefferson, most notably. But then you have others who actually explicitly go out of their way to say property is not a natural right, it's a social right, it's something that emerges only because of society. And then there were different disagreements about what kind of property ought to be valued and respected, right? So there was this fierce debate over property in intangible forms, right? Specifically property in the form of stocks and essentially things like bonds, right? Whether it was in the form of war debt or stocks in the bank. And some of those forms of property were not, putting it lightly, were not favored by people like Jefferson, in part because they thought that those forms of property actually were exploitative and formed relations of dependence on their own. In other words, it wasn't just that those who maybe are receiving the benefits that Payne talked about might become dependent, or the question is, can you ensure that people are able to provide for themselves? There was this argument that some Southern agrarians in particular made, that certain forms of property create relations of dependence of the wealthy on everyone else, where they're actually the idle class that is sort of reaching off of others. So there was this kind of early critique that developed of sort of high finance capitalism that I haven't really gotten into because it's sort of a little bit outside of the scope of my own work, but all I'm saying is that it's a very complicated.
I was wondering, in line with this relationship between property and power, and kind of in light of the fact that we're at the university talking about this, and UVA was obviously a model, I was wondering how much of these, how much of like intellectual property was included in this, for example, and how much of I also wanted to ask, how much of these principles were embedded in the physical structure of UVA, and for example, what were you allowed to bring with you when you came in as a freshman? Were you allowed to bring more property than others, or was it all kind of there for you? Did you get the furniture? Was there a distinction? Did people wear uniforms? I mean, there are all these kind of questions about social control when you're trying to establish the perfect and ideal society. And I mean, going back to the New Deal, these things were often kind of critiqued as being militaristic because the model we have for this is often in the military. But it struck me that Jefferson had a moment to actually implement, in physical terms, and also in intellectual terms, the idea that if you went to school at UVA, you would then, and you had children, your firstborn son would also go to UVA, and it's another form of this kind of social control where the intellectual component was property. Did you come across anything?
No, probably because I haven't really looked into that, and that's actually a fascinating question. I mean, I know sort of Jefferson's involvement in some of the very minute details of the little construction of the university, right, its architecture, which books they would read. I mean, he actually developed a curriculum of approved and unapproved works. And he's actually gotten criticized by a number of scholars for exercising a form of censorship because he thought certain works were inappropriate or unsuitable for fledgling Republicans. But on this point about intellectual property, the protection for intellectual property in the forms of patents and copyrights, I mean, that's written into the Constitution itself. But they left it up to Congress to decide, how long that would last and what sorts of things would be covered. So there was an interest in protecting that, but the arguments were less in terms of benefiting the creator, the inventor of the intellectual property, than in providing an incentive to benefit mankind. But many of the founders, including those who supported that legislation, would often renounce their own copyrights. So Payne was the inventor of a famous iron bridge, and he actually ended up, back in England and then in France, after he arrived here in 1786. Thomas Common Sense is published in 1787. Years later, he goes back, and one of the reasons he goes back to England is to promote this iron bridge that he invented, which was supposed to be over the Schuylkill River. There wasn't a lot of interest in it here. But he basically gives up his right to that. Common Sense, and he was, by the way, the biggest bestseller in the late 18th century. And he basically gave up his copyright to these huge best-selling works. So, for the benefit of mankind, as it were. Ben Franklin also sometimes gave up his copyrights and patents, in part to, for the benefit of mankind. Right? These are in many ways, products of the age of reason, saw themselves as being benefactors of humanity. But there was this understanding that everyone isn't as high-minded, and so you want to make sure that there is that incentive so that people will actually want to, create.
Well, thank you very much.